Right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Josh London, the head of Reuters Professional and the Chief Marketing Officer for Reuters. I'm delighted that you could join us today. We're so thrilled to be hosting this event with our colleagues from the Reuters Institute to launch the 2022 Digital News Report. And I'd like to start with a quote. And the quote is, "Sometimes when I finish reading articles, I feel more confused at the end and sometimes a little bit stressed about the situation." And that's not a quote from the report. It's actually a quote from my 17-year-old daughter. But it reflects quite a bit of what we have what we've seen in the report. It is, we have a sense of how news is changing, but exactly how it's changing, what audiences are thinking, and the robust data that comes from that reporting is something we really need to truly understand to help us make smart decisions. And that's what the Digital News Report gives us. We're now in the 11th year of the report. And the DNR, as we call it, has become the defining piece of annual research on news consumption. This year's report looks at the big issues shaping our industry, everything from consumption patterns to trust in media to social media usage and changing business models. And this panel of esteemed news industry professionals will discuss all of them after an overview of the report. But before I hand over to Rasmus, I'd like to add one thing. From an organization that supported journalists, often behind the scenes for the last 170 years, I'd like to recognize the craft of journalism. And, in my view, that has rarely, if ever, been more important than it is today. I'd like to thank our reporters and all of the reporters around the world for the service that they provide in helping us shine light in dark places and report on what others really would rather remain hidden. Or as one respondent put it, I feel that this is the most important time to know as much about our surroundings as possible. And I think you'll see today from our panelists and from the findings that that's exactly what we're doing. And with that, I'd like to thank you again all for coming and hand over to Rasmus. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Josh, for the opportunity to present here today, and thanks everyone for coming out, and for some of you coming into the city, which I know not everyone is doing regularly at this point. So, my name is Rasmus Nielsen. I'm director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and professor of political communication at the University of Oxford. And I'm really here today as a figurehead, if you will, from a team effort. I really want to stress that it's a large team that produced this report. And I'm very proud to be part of that team and have an opportunity here to socialize that work by presenting some of the key findings as we see them, but also to hear from industry leaders and all of you who are joining us here today what you make of these findings and what you think they portend for the future of journalism. What I want to do first is to just run through a few of the key findings as we see them. Some of them are global, some of them that I've highlighted today are about the US specifically, how it's similar to other markets, how it's different. And then we'll open up for a discussion on the basis of some of these key insights. Many of you will know the Reuters Institute Digital News Report is by now the largest ongoing publicly available study of news and media use across the world. We cover 46 markets on 6 continents with about 2,000 respondents in each of these markets. I should stress here that it's an online poll, so in countries where internet penetration is unequal or limited, it will underrepresent the habits of older people, people who are less privileged, and people in rural and marginalized communities of various sorts. But in a market like the United States, it's a nationally representative sample. I also want to thank the sponsors who make this work possible. Very happy to welcome Reuters on board this year as one of the media organizations that support the report. We work with media regulators such as Ofcom in the UK, foundations, universities, and a large grant from the Google News Initiative. We've been doing this report now, as Josh said, for 11 years, and that gives us a good handle, I think, on some of the ongoing structural changes in the public's relationship with news and media. Some of them are well understood in the industry, even if not always welcome. Things such as the structural decline, very pronounced in print, very pronounced in television, though less developed so far than that of print. But I also think that there are some long-term changes that are perhaps not so clearly recognized in the industry and the profession yet that we have data on. So, for example, in the United States, when we look at the sources of news that people say they've used in the past week, we have some well-known trends like these. We also have this development, that over the last years, there's been a marked growth in the number of people who say they've used none of these sources of news in the past week. A part of that, our research would suggest is that the public connection between many people and journalism and news is weakening. We asked people a question about how interested they are in news, and in many countries across the world, the developments in this area, like though less visible perhaps than the decline of print circulation or TV, the aging of TV audiences, is actually quite profound. 20 percentage point drop in the percentage of people in the United States who say that they are interested or very interested in the news. Similar or even larger drops in many other markets, though there are some markets where the declines are less pronounced or even not even happening. It is a general trend across many of the markets that we look at that people say that they're less interested in news than they were in the past. We also see changes, of course, in the relationship between political orientation and how people use the news. One way to think about how that plays out in society is in terms of, sorry, this is the selective news avoidance first. The social contract is weakening with declining interest in news, but also amongst many people who are avid news consumers, people managing their relationship with the news more actively by selectively avoiding news, often or sometimes. The numbers have grown in many markets. It was already high in the United States in 2017 when we asked the question last, but by now 42% of our American respondents say that they often or sometimes actively try to avoid the news. When we ask them why, part of this is about politics. Some would say that they find the news untrustworthy or biased. This is often people who are politically on the right. But there are also other dimensions to this. And a large number of those who selectively avoid the news say that the news has a negative effect on their mood, and that they manage these feelings by selectively avoiding the news, perhaps something that some of us in the room can recognize from our own personal experience. These are just a few quotes from our qualitative work about how people describe that feeling of the news making them feel powerless and triggering their anxiety, and the decision to manage that in part by actively avoiding the news from time to time. News avoidance can also be related to other things. So for example, there is a question of whether people always carry with them the things that we assume, the work that we put on them on the basis of the things that we presuppose in our reporting and our coverage. We have large numbers of people, in particular younger people, who say that they selectively avoid the news because they find it too difficult to understand, in particular amongst younger people. So I think a real set of questions here about whether we assume things that people aren't actually equipped with or don't want to be equipped with when we cover things such as politics or business. Trust is also a dimension of this relationship between the public and news and journalism. Last year, in the depth of the coronavirus pandemic, we saw an increase in trust in news in many countries as people were reminded of the value and importance of independent, credible reporting, often in situations where politicians were lying or misleading about the severity and nature of the pandemic. Unfortunately, from the point of view of journalists and editors, much of that trust bump has dissipated in the last year. We are not quite back to where we were before the pandemic, but we have seen declines in many markets, including the United States. A few markets have seen increases, and there is a lot of variation from country to country. But as of this year, the US is tied at the bottom with Slovakia, Hungary, Greece, and Taiwan in terms of the percentage of people who say that they trust the news, and it's declined even further from an already low base. Part of this, of course, is about politics in the United States, at least. When we break out our respondents by their political orientation, it won't surprise people in this room to see that there is a significant difference between those on the political right and those on the political left. But I think it is important to note here that the developments over the last years have been a combination of a large increase initially in trust in news amongst those on the political left when Mr. Trump was elected president in 2016, perhaps because people saw independent news media as a way to hold the president to account, but also combined with a further erosion of already low trust in the news amongst people on the political right, perhaps because they were attuned to some of the attacks that were emanating from the White House and other prominent right-wing politicians and voices against other news media. And then some erosion actually on the left, in particular in the last years of the Trump presidency and in the beginning of the Biden presidency. But I think it's important to recognize here that politics doesn't play out the same way in every market, right? So this is just at the other end of the extreme in terms of levels of trust. In Finland, for example, there's almost no political difference between trust in news in the political left and trust in news in the political right. And actually in the UK, where we're based, people on the political right trust the news more than people on the political left. So there's not a universal pattern here. To really sort of understand the peculiarities of America in that context, this is where I get to the polarization point I was already jumping to. We try to understand the way in which public attention to news is structured along political lines by mapping news organizations on the basis of the political composition of their audience. So you can imagine at one end of the spectrum a news organization that only have left-wing people paying attention to it, and at the other extreme of the spectrum, people who only have people on the right paying attention to it. And then in the middle, news organizations who have politically diverse and or politically moderate audiences. This is what such a map looks like in the United States. A large number of news organizations that are competing for attention, primarily with audiences that are centrist, moderate, and or left-leaning and liberal. And then a limited number of news organizations, Fox News, of course, by far the single most important one of them, that have very clearly right-wing audiences, and then basically very little in the sort of center-right space in the United States. This is very different from what we see in most European countries. I'm just going to show one point of comparison. This is what it looks like in Germany, a country that last year had elections where there was a lot of concern about populist politicians, both on the far right and on the far left. And where there are, very real discussions around issues like this, but where actually most news organizations have very politically diverse audiences, and often audience stratification in Germany is more about class, level of education, level of income, and geography, where in the country you are, than they are about politics. So very different audience structure from that in the United States. In addition to the questions of the cultural connection that exists between the public and news, we of course also care about the business models in which independent professional journalism are based. And as you all know, a large part of that increasingly is reader revenue as the industry moves from a heavy emphasis on advertising and some reader revenue to a greater emphasis on reader revenue as advertising money increasingly goes to a few large technology companies. This year, in terms of the top line number of people who say in 20 markets where we have good data that they have paid in some way for online news in the past year, we see very little growth. A few markets have had significant increases, but in most markets the number are stable and no significant increase. Across 20 markets, it's 17% who say that they've paid in some form for online news in the last year, and no change in that headline figure in our data this year. So to get a better understanding of the dynamics in that market, we look at what are the titles that people say that they subscribe to in this environment. And what we see across the world is a combination of some very clear shared dynamics, which is that in most markets, though not equally consolidated in every market, we have very strong winner-takes-most dynamics, a limited number of generally upmarket national titles that account for half or nearly half of all online news subscriptions. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post in this country. Then there is significant variation in how many of the people who say they subscribe to online news, who say that they pay for local titles in the United States and a few other markets. The figure is actually sort of relatively high compared to most of the markets that we cover. But of course, the context here in the United States is a world in which just 20 years ago, the American newspaper industry primarily was a local industry based on local titles that together were a much larger part of the industry than a few titles with national aspirations, whereas now increasingly a few national titles actually dominate the industry in terms of subscriptions, attention, and advertising that goes to news. And then there are other markets where there's been no breakthrough so far in terms of people subscribing to local news online. Some other variation is the question of how many titles people are willing to pay for when it comes to online news. We have just 2 markets out of 20 where the median number of online news subscriptions is 2. In every other market, the winner takes most dynamic is in large part a competition for the one thing that people might be willing to pay for when it comes to online news. But in the US by now, more than half of those who subscribe to online news subscribe to 2 titles or more, often a national upmarket title, and then one other thing, whether that is sports, local, or a niche interest of some sort. That niche interest could be subscribing to an individual journalist using, for example, Substack or podcast or other forms of individual subscription. But so far, even in the United States, where this development has gone much further than we've seen anywhere else, it's just 7% of those who say they subscribe to online news, who say they subscribe to an individual journalist working on their own. And in many other markets, the figure is much, much lower than that, just 1%, so essentially a rounding error. So not quite the development yet that some made of it early on in the rise of Substack and other platforms for such models. Part of the context here, of course, from the point of view of citizens who might consider to pay for news, is, as many of us will know from a quick glance at our own credit card statement, a number of other media subscriptions and the growing number of digital businesses that encourage us to subscribe to a service or product or content that they're offering. And looking here just specifically at the United States, when we look at a series of forms of digital media subscriptions, the profile I think will be of interest to people here. I think there are a couple of key takeaways from a chart like this in terms of the business of news. One is that there are much higher levels of subscription for all the other kinds of digital media content that we ask people about. Many more people subscribing to subscription video on demand, music, audiobooks or podcasts or sports than subscribe to news. And secondly, that contrary to the idea that the problem is that the young uns are not willing to pay for things in an online environment because they've grown up with a culture of free, actually on closer inspection, the age profile of every kind of digital media subscription except for news skews younger. News is the only kind in our data set that skews older. So I think this is sort of quite a revealing a chart in terms of the sort of product market fit when it comes to news from the point of view of younger people in particular, who clearly are willing to pay for things online that they think stand out, but may not be convinced yet that that's the case for even news organizations that many of us in this room personally will have a lot of respect for. Where are we heading with payments? We asked people sort of a hypothetical question. Do you expect to have fewer subscriptions, more subscriptions, the same number next year? Largely, the number suggests some stability, which should be encouraging, I think, for those who have built a subscription basis. Retention is an easier challenge than acquisition. And we don't yet see a sign of sort of a great retreat from subscriptions, at least in these hypothetical questions. And people might say, well, there is a cost of living crisis coming, but there are also others who say, look, this is important. I'm willing to pay, even if I have to tighten my belt in other areas. So beyond the sort of question of payment and trust in news in general, we have a set of questions and findings this year really about how people orient themselves in this ever more competitive environment for attention. And one of the things we've been curious to understand better is the relative importance of news brands versus individual journalists and how people orient themselves in news online. And the findings here have some variation across the countries that we cover, but also a pretty clear pattern that in almost every market we cover, a clear majority, often a very large majority, say they pay more attention to news brands than to individual journalists when they orient themselves and pay attention to news online. But there are, in addition to the sort of markets that are heavily dominated by brands, some markets, and partially including the US, where individual journalists seem to play a more prominent role in how people seek out and find news online. Who are these individual journalists then? We asked an open-ended question in the survey this year where we asked people to name a journalist that they know of or more. They have several options so they can enter the names. More than half of our respondents don't name any journalists that they can think of. But amongst those who do, in the United States, the names that appear most frequently are overwhelmingly men, overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly from broadcast backgrounds, and I think I can say without offending anyone that they are often quite polarizing figures. that don't necessarily command universal respect. And very few are from national or local newspapers. But again, it's important to understand that it doesn't need to be like this. It isn't like this in every market, right? So in the UK, for example, while it's also here the case that most of them are men, an even larger majority of them are white, slightly more of them are sort of pundits from national newspapers or magazines. But here, of course, the context is important to consider in that they are generally host, anchors, or editors who work for broadcasters that are obliged by regulation to be duly impartial. So very different from the US context. And actually in that space, in the UK, these strong opinions come from print titles and online titles, not from broadcasters. More broadly, in terms of how people find and access news online, as all of us will know from personal experience, people will access online news in many different ways. Sometimes they'll go to apps or news sites, sometimes they'll use search, sometimes they'll use social or other ways of getting news online. Every year we ask people about a range of options in this space, and then we ask a follow-up question about what is your most important or main way of accessing news online. And what we find there is an ongoing movement towards distributed discovery, where by now just 23% of our respondents say that going direct to a news site or app is their main way of getting news online. And a much larger number of people rely on social media, search, or aggregators, various forms of platform intermediaries. And actually this year is the first year where social media is statistically significantly more often named as a main way of accessing news online than going direct to a news site or app. And the development over time, I think, is pretty clear when we look at just the difference between direct access and social media access in recent years across the markets that we cover. Even though, of course, there are very significant country-to-country variations. So a handful of countries in mostly Northwestern Europe with very strong direct relationships between news organizations and the public, also online. And then a number of markets, many of them in Asia Pacific and Sub-Saharan Africa, where social really is the main gateway to news for the majority. When we think about this, it's also in part about, of course, the development of new platforms with sort of compelling value propositions and convenience and new ways of accessing content of all sorts online, but also about gradual generational displacement, where when we break down, this is just taking data from the United States, the habits of different age groups, the 18 to 24-year-olds, the 25 to 34-year-olds, and the respondents who are 35 or older in a given year, this is development that we see over time in the United States. So a significant drop from an already low base in the number of 18 to 24-year-old respondents who say they've gone to a website or news app in the last week. Not that it's their main way of getting online news, but whether they have done it, right? 20% say they've gone to a news site or app in the past week. Similar decline amongst the 25 to 34-year-olds. And then actually amongst the older respondents, 35 and older, it's been more stable. But what we're seeing here is a gap opening up as a new generation comes of age who have grown up with social being one of the main ways in which they access all sorts of content, including news. Now, what social means, of course, is changing over time. Again, this is just looking at the 18 to 24-year-old respondents in the United States. And what we see over time is a change from a world in which not so long ago, it was really primarily about Facebook, also for that younger demographic. And then a gradual and then accelerating decline of Big Blue, even as Instagram and WhatsApp, and in recent years, TikTok in particular, became more and more important. TikTok is globally the fastest growing network for news. Amongst the 18 to 24-year-old demographic across the markets that we cover, 40% say they've used TikTok for any purpose in the past week, and 15% say they've used it as a way of getting or accessing news. And when we look at all our respondents in a number of markets in the global south, the figures are much, much higher. And we get sort of different responses here about what that might mean for people. So finally, how should journalists carry themselves in that environment? We ask a top-line question about whether journalists should stick to reporting the news or whether they should also be allowed to express personal opinions as well as reporting the news. And in most markets, we have a majority saying that journalists should stick to reporting the news when they are on social media, but also a significant minority of people who say that they want them to be able to express personal opinions as well as reporting the news. And in a few markets, actually, that's a majority or plurality. Of course, people's opinion about this are quite different amongst other things, by generation. So just looking at the United States, perhaps reflecting differences that may also exist inside newsrooms in addition to in the public at large. Essentially, for all the respondents who are 35 or older, there is a plurality or a majority who say that journalists should stick to reporting and sharing the news when they're on social. But amongst the younger demographics, there is actually a plurality of respondents who say that they feel that journalists should be able to express their personal opinions alongside reporting on the news. So a quick recap, and then I'll invite our panelists to join me on stage for a conversation. We have a very clear evidence, I think, by now that there is a sense of disconnection that's growing between much of the public and the news, even as it's very clear also that a number of publishers are demonstrably succeeding in this very competitive environment. We also, in our data, see that the sort of trust bump of the pandemic seems to have dissipated in many markets, and in some countries, including the United States, political polarization is really eating away at trust in news, at least among some groups. A pretty mixed picture when it comes to online news payment. Again, it's very clear that there are individual titles that are succeeding far beyond what would have been the wildest dreams 10 years ago, but it's also clear that much of the public isn't paying for news, don't want to pay for news particularly, and actually aren't convinced by the value proposition, even of the most impressive current forms of journalism. Then we have the sort of the further erosion of the relationship between much of the public and the idea of going direct to a news site or app, and this sort of growing reliance on various forms of intermediaries, social and search, very key amongst them, and very different opinions in different groups about how journalists should carry themselves on social media, for example. Finally, visual social networks continue to gain for news. Facebook's still number one in terms of overall usage and usage for news in most of the markets that we look at, but losing ground amongst younger users. And Instagram, TikTok, and Telegram are the only networks that we see grow this year overall. This can feel depressing, I think, for journalists and editors and executives to face this. And I want to say two things about that, and then I'll invite the panelists to come join us for the conversation. One is that I think for a profession, an industry that prides itself on calling it as they see it and reporting it as it is, even when it is unwelcome, I think we have to be willing to sort of deal with that ourselves as well. And I suppose that's the sort of the spirit of what we work at the Reuters Institute is we'll call it as we see it, and even when it isn't always that encouraging. And the other thing I want to say about where this leaves us is that I think we need to sort of also remember that this is the most competitive marketplace for attention in human history. And the fact that there are a growing number of publishers who are demonstrably succeeding in that is a testament to the value of their journalism, as Josh said at the outset, and their ability to adapt to a environment and a society that has changed at warp speed in recent years. So I will now invite our panelists, all of whom have navigated those changes, to join me on stage, and then we'll open up for a discussion after we heard from the panelists first. Thank you very much. So I wanted to turn to you first, Melissa, because you and I have talked before about the sort of question of people selectively avoiding the news, the question of the sort of erosion of interest in at least in some forms of currently existing journalism. Do you want to speak to your experience at Vox about how you think about these challenges and how you're responding to them?
Sure. This is something that has been integral to what we've tried to approach at Vox since the beginning of our organization 8 years ago. We have been stuck in a format in news that is primarily an older technology, a print newspaper that we moved online and didn't do much to adapt to it. And I don't think that that is allowing audiences to interact with that format in a way that reaches them reaches and addresses their needs today. What you see is instead of what we had 20 years ago where there was not a lot of access to information, you have so much information that it's overwhelming, it is exhausting, it is, as you said in the report, at sometimes anxiety-inducing and making people feel powerless. So we need to address not just the formats, but the approach that we take to journalism to look at those specific needs and see how we're answering that. I think that the big thing that rings out to me is around the question of powerlessness. what do we do to help people feel like they have more power and control and can make, to Josh's point, smart decisions about their lives? When you read a news article about a terrible event in a foreign country or something that's happening in a state or in the United States, and there's no information about how you can approach that problem individually, of course you're going to walk away feeling powerless. Of course you're going to feel like you have no control in the situation. So what can you do? Can we approach journalism with an idea of being a service to audiences versus just publishers? I think that that's something that we think about a lot.
Monica, at the New York Times, you've been extraordinarily successful in recent years. You've sold me a subscription, but
Thank you very much.
well, I appreciate it. If you feel I'm not duly impartial, I can leave now. But then, I'm a rich old white guy. So how do you think about the challenge that Melissa's speaking to here about, producing something that can convince other people, perhaps younger people, for example, or people who aren't like me in other ways, that what you do at the New York Times is valuable enough for them to pay attention to and potentially to pay for?
Great question. So what we really think about first is this sort of atomic unit of everything that we do, which is the story, right? So we've really drilled down into thinking about dreaming up stories that are slightly different than the ones that we would have published 5, 10 years ago. We try to publish things that are unpredictable. We, of course, look for the truth. We look for the dramatic story that no one quite knows yet. So we actually make sure to really drill down on what we're doing. We've also increasingly just been more transparent about what we do. So what that means is, now you see little bugs with mugshots of the writers, explaining who they are, explaining what their background is. We reveal how we're covering the Ukraine, because younger readers just really want to, they want you to show receipts. So that's what we try to do on a daily basis. And then the other thing we do is we experiment with a lot of different story forms that feel more native to younger readers. So we have these live blogs that are, help you endlessly scroll on a topic. It's something that people understand how to do if they're, they didn't grow up folding pages like I did. So it feels comfortable and it reaches them. And then one of the other things we do is we invest quite a bit in making the stories that we find easy to find on search, which is actually a way that it's not the youngest platform, but it is a way of broadening the audience, and it's a sort of less contained surface. So people are there just trying to find information. They're not there to sort of be fed news necessarily. So we've done a lot of investments in just making sure that our pieces are discoverable.
Arlyn, at Reuters, in addition to the fact that I can download your app and access Reuters News direct, you also have, of course, a huge number of business-to-business clients. Some of them have pay models, some of them don't. How do you think, from Reuters' point of view, about this sort of question of making news, both for those willing to pay for it, but also for a wider audience?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think for us, unlike the Times or other outlets where you've got a singular audience and you break down the demographics, we've got multiple business streams and different audiences there. So how we treat those individual client sets is very different across the board. Online, for what we do on the site, it kind of mirrors that different relationship that we have with clients. There's always going to be the mass audience that comes in through search. They're going to be that audience we want to convert into the funnel to register users, eventually subscribers. Subscribers, and not subscribers yet, but loyalists right now are registered users, and they behave very differently. So you have to construct an experience for them that is unique and engaging and long-lasting, while at the same time understanding that the majority of your audience, as one of your slides showed, comes in sideways, and you have to cater to them as well, try to entice them to kind of engage with you further and kind of go from casual user to registered user to loyalist and hopefully evangelist, right? And so we're always having to kind of think of how to operate at multiple speeds and at different levels. So,
Olivia, I think one thing we see again in our research this year, and I think has been an issue of growing concern in much of the profession and industry, is the risk of growing inequality, basically, and a sort of a world in which people like me who are willing and able to pay are exceptionally well served by a range of titles. More and more titles increasingly have incentives to orient themselves towards me, but where much of the public isn't convinced. At Google, you want to and need to serve everybody. How do you think about that set of issues from the point of view of the Google News Initiative?
Yeah, I think, when we absolutely do think about designing our products for everyone. That is one of the great privileges and challenges of having a company that it builds products on a global scale. And we need to be able to support a range of different types of business models for publishers. So, of course, many publishers are still ad-supported. That is an incredibly important part of the open web and being able to provide access to a wide range of content for people, as you note, who are maybe not in a position to pay for a new subscription. While also, I think, evolving as business models have evolved, particularly over the last 5+ years, and more publishers that we work with have moved more towards a reader revenue model. We have likewise invested in products and solutions to be able to support that set of partners that we work with. So we do really want to be able to address the needs of the ecosystem as a whole and all different types of both user needs as well as our publishing partner needs. One thing I did want to note, Subscribe with Google is one of the products that we developed sort of really in partnership with the news industry after hearing from many of our partners that we worked with that there was a growing desire to have a more plug and play sort of scaled solution to think about how to address reader revenue from a technical standpoint. And that's a product that we launched, in 2018. But what we've heard from many of our partners since then is actually, hey, we also want to be able to support other types of business models like contributions and memberships. And so we've been able to work with partners to evolve the types of business models that product can support to be able to better address what we see as evolving needs. And we're seeing some publishers in the news space in the United States starting to reevaluate, okay, is a reader revenue, is a subscriptions model right for me? Even Quartz and the Austin American-Statesman just in the last couple of months have announced that they're actually moving more towards a membership model. So I think it shows actually quite a lot of flexibility and experimentation in the industry, which is really, really exciting to see.
Melissa, I know that at Vox you've worked hard on these things as well. There's been perhaps a moment now where a lot of the industry is sort of congregating around the idea of digital subscriptions. You've chosen a different path. Do you want to share a bit of your thinking around this issue of sort of non-pay revenue models for news production?
We, at Vox Media, we actually do have a subscription business with New York Magazine and Cafe Podcast, a small cafe podcast group that we acquired last year. And both of those are very strong businesses. I think subscriptions has helped turn around a lot of the businesses that we see in the industry. It's also acknowledged the reader's desire to support journalism. But I think that there are two problems that we looked at a couple of years ago. One was it's a very crowded market. There's a lot of subscriptions, not just as you mentioned in news, but people are spending money on Netflix and Disney Plus and HBO and there's also definitely a challenge with creating strong, accessible journalism for everyone. And not just for those who can afford it. And so we decided 2 years ago or really 2.5 years ago, to approach a contributions model at Vox. And what we found was that our audience wanted to support the work in part for others to be able to access the information for free. That was a strong, resounding answer when we surveyed them as to why they were motivated to contribute. And it's really solidified the fact that there is something in this desired audience to help support others. And I think that that's something that you'll see more often, especially at the local level. I'm encouraged that we're seeing organizations like this try that out, because there is, I think for journalism audiences, they're recognizing that there is a need for better, clearer information out there. And if we have everyone move into a paywalled universe, it's going to be very hard for people to have that kind of information on a daily basis. It's interesting to me, too, the choices that places like the New York Times are making as to when they take the paywall down and when they don't. It's a choice, I think, that they're having to make to say this is information that is so necessarily a public good that we need to remove the paywall. And I'm really encouraged that we can treat all of our journalism as a public good at Fox and say this is worthwhile for everyone to see.
So this is a hard one, I think, for the industry and the profession to really wrestle with. But it's one thing to say that something is for everyone. It's something else entirely whether they're willing to pay attention to it. You know, in our data, and ComScore finds roughly the same, something like half of American internet users haven't gone to a news site in the past week. And I suppose our research would suggest that amongst other factors, this is about not being convinced that the news is valuable enough to pay attention to, but also the concerns that people, in particular in the political right, have about whether it's trustworthy, whether it's biased. I mean, Arlyn, do you want to say something about how you at Reuters think about this question of trust, in particular in a very polarized context like the United States, where in principle anyone could read Reuters right now, but many people may think that even Reuters, with its commitment to the trust principles, is biased and not for people like them. How do you think of that issue of trust in a polarized society?
I think we, one, benefit from a strong tradition of calling balls and strikes, not to use baseball metaphors, which I don't often do, but you know, I think the trust principles, which were enacted shortly after World War II, kind of gave us a reputation, or helped us build a reputation over time, that I think many of us in the newsroom and in the organization at large feel very protective of that reputation, and once that trust is breached, it's easily lost. So in terms of, you know, the polarizing nature of news, we have been, I think, somewhat benefiting from the fact that we have this reputation that, you know, we're just calling it straight, presenting as many sides as possible, especially with Ukraine. I mean, we saw a traffic spike like everybody else did. We saw some encouraging signs just from our own analytics in real time that we were getting more traffic from Eastern Europe and that part of the world coming to us to try to figure out what was true, until some of that got shut down for various reasons. But that was encouraging, and I think in moments like that, we still do benefit from global audiences, even US audiences, coming to us for that straight up take. And I think for us, the goal in terms of packaging our content, online in particular, is doing it in a way that we've got the main news of the day, surrounding it with analysis that makes sense for all our different constituencies. Like I mentioned before, Reuters is a very different thing depending on where you are in the world. In Europe, it's a little bit more general news. In the US, it's more of a business wire. So we don't shy away from either reputation, and I think the value for us is having boots on the ground for situations like Ukraine, but also having the kind of nuanced business coverage that talks about the macroeconomic implications, and then from a policy perspective, we also do the geopolitical angle to it. So we're trying to offer up a 360-degree view for anyone who comes to us.
Monica, I don't know many members of the Democratic Socialists of America who believe that the New York Times is left-leaning, but there might be others who think that you're basically a mouthpiece for the Second Communist International. How do you, at the Times, think about this issue of polarization and how you find a way through that with the values that you represent in the New York Times?
Yeah, I mean, this is just a really complicated news environment. It's a complicated environment for any institution to sort of not be characterized or viewed as overly partisan. a few things that we do and we have done in the past year is we've increased our investment in trust and credibility. We have, in fact, created a cross-functional team of journalists, people from product, to really think about, how can we be more transparent, and also how can we sort of prove out every day that we're a trustworthy source of the truth. So we've made a significant investment in that. As I mentioned before, more transparency about our news gathering. We've also we've always done this, but been much more forthright about the fact that we send people all around the world, including to war zones, to gather information, in the case of Ukraine, even before some international organizations got there. So, we're capturing images, we're sort of parsing data, we're expending a lot of energy to bring people the story and sort of being really transparent about that effort. I think we can't really control necessarily how we're characterized, but at least we can control the stories that we produce. And we're, making sure that whenever there's a major storyline, we are covering the Supreme Court leak of the Roe decision, not just as people who are not just covering the pro-life community, but actually pro-choice community, but covering pro-life people who are buoyed by it, in fact, and not turning away from those types of stories.
Thanks, Monica. Olivia, the trust issue is also relevant for a search engine. Generally, in our work, we found that people have even lower levels of trust in news they find via search than they have in news in general, though not as low as for social, but still some trust gap. And of course, you also present people with titles that many of us will trust, but some might see as sort of biased or partisan or political, whether that's featuring Fox News or featuring the New York Times or featuring other brands that some will find polarizing. How do you think about this issue of trust from the point of view of search?
Yeah, it's sort of the core, I think, of all of search and the way that we think about building a search engine. The whole premise of search is based on the notion of ranking, and ranking is really a way to try and create the most relevant, trustworthy, and authoritative answers to a question that somebody has. So we are highly incentivized, both from a mission standpoint, from a business model standpoint, to make sure that we are showing the most trustworthy and relevant information at the very top of search results. So it's very much baked in, I think, to how we think about every aspect of product development. But to your point about sort of, the range of different types of sources that we show in our products, we actually see sort of almost the opposite, which is that by showing a range of perspectives and being able to say, when somebody comes to search, as Monica said, they're often looking for something specific. And we often see that people, when they have a question about the credibility of a piece of content, or they hear about something on social media, or a friend shares something to them in their group chat, they're coming to search or to Google News to say, okay, I've heard about this, and I actually want to understand what this is. Is this true? How do I verify this information? How do I understand the credibility of this claim? So we actually see these, what we call sort of credibility journeys, as being a really important use case that people, and a really important function that search can play. And by showing, we actually build a lot of these sort of information literacy tools directly into our product. So features like, for example, what we call full coverage, which is when you search for a particular news story, you can see all of the coverage from a range of different sources about that story. And that helps people say, wow, I can actually see there is a range of perspectives on here. I can do my own research and then make my own opinion. And that actually builds a lot of trust, because as opposed to seeing one perspective, they're able to look at everything. We also built in other features like fact checks and building that directly into both search and Google News. Added a new label actually just last month called highly cited sources, so that when you're looking at a search result, you can see this is a story that is being highly cited by other reputable news sources, and we see those are the types of things that actually really help people build their confidence as they're navigating the web, to say, okay, I feel like I have some skills and some tools now that I can apply to help me understand whether or not this is a trustworthy piece of content. So, absolutely critical. We take it very, extremely seriously. And I think, the notion of bias in our search results is we think about it very much through the lens of expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness without any notion of political leaning one way or the other.
I want to end the panel discussion with the last question before opening it up for people in the room to ask questions or offer their own thoughts. Which, and I'll start with you, Melissa, on this one, is another sort of angle in the trust discussion is the question of how journalists and editors think about the proper relationship between reporting and opinion and how that's expressed in public. We have this data now on public opinion on whether journalists who are on social media should stick to sharing and reporting the news, or whether it's also fine for them to express their personal opinions in addition to sharing the news and reporting the news. How do you think about that issue at Vox?
I thought that the numbers that you showed were really telling in the way that, and reflect partly how we consider it at Vox as well, that there are people who, in older generations, who have had an experience with news in years past, want this idea of a more traditional idea of objectivity, that you're just sticking to the facts and that's the work that you do. I think a newswire service like Reuters or AP, that is the service that they provide, and it's a very excellent service that they provide. Most other news organizations, though, do provide a level of analysis. Even in a fundamental editorial decision, you are injecting some point of view in the choice of the story that you're covering. And I think that you see younger audiences wanting and craving the story of why we are making that choice. They want to hear, to Monica's point, how we've arrived at the work that we have compiled. And I think that there's been a really good discussion around objectivity in the industry over the last few years, where we need to stop assuming that a reporter is objective. They have lived experiences. They come to a story with their own biases, but the work needs to be done in an objective manner. We need to be working to arrive at a conclusion in a thoughtful way where we can provide a decision about what we are presenting to the audience, but it is not one that lacks background of your own biases that you bring to the story. So for Vox, it's very important to us that our reporters are upfront with who they are, upfront with what opinions they bring to the story, both opinions that allow their decisions to change over time. Some of the best reporting that I think that we do at Vox are reporters who say, I came to the story with one hypothesis and I'm leaving it with a different because I'm taking you on the journey of my own understanding. The joy of journalism is that we get to actually pursue our curiosity and learn through the process of reporting, and we should be bringing the audience along with us in that joy of the journey. I loved the credibility journey that you talked about. I am very pessimistic about our current state of media in the US right now. These numbers are deeply depressing and should be a very strong wake-up call for all of us in journalism. But what does make me optimistic and hopeful is that people are searching for information and want to understand what's happening in the world around them. There's still a deep curiosity in people, and we need to bring them along with us. And that's where we should not be afraid to show who we are in that process.
I mean, I wish we could wrap it up there because that was a clarion call, but I won't, because I think, Arlyn, Melissa said some very nice things about Reuters, but what if there are people out there who really crave learning more about the Reuters journalist, how they think about these things, what's the journey they've been on, what's their own lived experience of what they're covering? How do you think about this from Reuters' point of view? If people want this, can you give it to them, or are there ways for Reuters to navigate this thicket?
It's tough, and thank you for the compliment. It's tough because there is kind of a generational shift that you were articulating about how people should behave, let alone on social media, which is often a slippery slope and at best just squishy ground a lot of the time. You have a generation of young journalists, and it's the same as the consumers that you highlighted on one of the slides. We're drawing from the same pool of people who have a different expectation of how they can be perceived. The idea of a personal brand certainly didn't exist when I was a young journalist coming up. That's a brand new thing. For us, and I guess for a lot of newsrooms, right, it's also a recruiting headache, because how do you keep true to what you do as a newsroom while accommodating a crew of people who expect to have a personal brand? And how quickly will you lose that generation of talented young journalists who are craving for that, but at the same time kind of put guardrails around them to make sure that they don't overstep, while still also allowing for free speech. It's a difficult balancing act, one that certainly we are actively negotiating on every single day. When we're recruiting, it's a conversation. I say, what do you think about personal brands when I'm looking for new social producers? There's no right or wrong answer to that. I think it evolves over time, and it depends on the social platform. We have experimented a lot with different platforms. There's Twitter, which I think we understand really well, and that's okay. But sometimes it's increasingly Instagram and what people share or overshare from their own personal accounts, things like that. From a newsroom perspective, and to solve for that kind of personal brand issue and what we do, it's bringing in those people to host an Instagram Live, to do a conversation with a reporter from behind the scenes. And that's one way that they can still operate within our ecosystem, but also give them a place to shine on social and develop a following. I think for us, that's the model we continue to develop, and I think probably the safest one at the moment.
How do you think about this at the time?
Yeah, we've sort of struck that balance. I mean, one thing about just behavior on social media and speech in general is that the traditional model has been like, what's the best way to get a story? It's by observing, listening, watching, taking a lot of information in. It doesn't involve projecting a lot about yourself and who you are outward to the world. So we recently, for example, introduced a new policy to the New York Times newsroom on Twitter, and we just said, look, like, you can go on Twitter, but Twitter's a great space to listen to other people, to follow people who are very unlike you, and to learn from them. That's our overall philosophy. And the more time you spend sort of building your own personality in that ecosystem or elsewhere, just the less time you're dedicating to actually thinking about editing or pursuing stories. But we have struck that balance. We're a big media organization now, and we have podcasts, and we have Instagram account, and we have all sorts of things, opportunities for people internally to just become known and sort of build out their identity. And we have some outsized personalities as a result.
Melissa rightly highlighted that everyone is very curious. I imagine there might be some curiosity in the room as well. So this is where we open up for questions or short speeches disguised as questions. So if you'll please raise your hand if you have any questions or comments. Please say who you are and direct the question at any one of the panelists or myself. Please, we have a question over here, I think. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Karen Wilson. I'm at the New York Times. I'm an audience editor. Oh, thanks. Hi, I'm Karen Wilson. I'm an audience editor at the New York Times, and I have a question for you, Rasmus. I was struck by the fact that on that report about subscribers and nationally, Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany seem to capture the most subscribers under 30. It was 34%, 25%, 26%, respectively. Do you have any more research, or can you speak more about what they've done to capture younger subscribers?
Thanks. A couple of things I'd highlight for several titles in those markets have, from well before digital, had very differentiated offerings for different age groups. So for example, take Site in Germany, which has for a long time had a dedicated team that produced what was called Site Campus, which was aimed at offering a site product for university students that was completely focused on what their interest might be, things they might be curious about. And that was used as part of a bundle to sort of also get them interested in the Site weekly newspaper. Site also launched digitally what was called Set, a digital-only sub-brand that was only focused on reaching younger people online, largely an off-site platform-first play. And their only sort of goals were to build younger audience. And again, it was used as a standalone offer, but also as a way to introduce people to a brand that they might have thought were for sort of older people, to be crude. But actually, they found these were very useful ways, both to do something that was editorial and commercially relevant for serving a particular audience, but also to lead them to the sort of the flagship brand. And you know, the site I think is a great example of a title that's been able to use its traditional strengths, but also set aside resources to invest in offering things that both are valuable on their own, but help people get to the flagship brand. Question here at the back.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Heather Landy from Quartz. And I just wondered for any of the panelists, is there a pathway for, in a world where the homepage is dead and text-based social is dying and people are generally exhausted by the news and search is on the rise, is there a path for trustworthy journalism that's not necessarily on breaking news that people are searching for? For accountability journalism and enterprise features that people ought to know about, but they don't know about it yet, so they're not searching for it. And they're not finding it on social because they're not going on Facebook, and they're not finding it at qz.com because they don't go to homepages. Is there room in the world for that kind of journalism anymore, or should I just stick to, writing about the latest news in Ukraine because that's what will rise to the top of search today?
Melissa.
Yeah, I'd say that there definitely is, and I think it's actually more important than ever for us to have that type of journalism out there. I do think that it's important for us. I mentioned at the beginning, we need to be constantly thinking about how we approach audiences in the way that they want to access information today. And a lot of what we talk about up here has been text-based websites, and I think it's really important that we're recognizing that we think about how to bring that type of journalism to podcasts, to television series, to TikToks. And there still is a space for a deeper, longer read, but we should be taking that same journalism to Monica's point about the atomic ideal of the story and distributing it in very different ways. I think about this all of the time, that our audiences are not just readers. You have audio listeners who learn best from listening to people speak. You have people who are visual learners. You have people who learn best from reading. And we should be thinking about taking all of our work and distributing it in those various formats as much as possible.
I'll just briefly add that, our approach has been to really produce groundbreaking work that will start a conversation. And then we find out that people ultimately will search for it. And so, think about the story, think about the best way to distribute it. We do it on Instagram, we'll do it, on a podcast, we'll do it on our website. But if there's a Trump taxes story, then people will look for it. So really the aspiration for us is to produce impactful journalism, and I think that applies to the industry overall.
I'll just add that I think at the same time it's important to recognize that this is a world without guardrails, right? And you know well from personal experience that this can be very difficult, and it's not always going to work out, and that's unwelcome and stressful and hard on people, and lots of journalists are losing their jobs, lots of businesses are not hitting their targets, and that's a very challenging environment, and I think it's important we say that out loud and don't give people sort of false hope that it's going to work for everybody or everywhere. At the same time, I think sort of 5 years ago or so, there were people who were saying, oh, the only forms of journalism that will thrive are those who do well in social media, and it's going to be all cat videos till the heat death of the universe. And that's clearly not been the case, right? The titles that are doing best in most cases are titles that lots of journalists around the world would say represent some of the most respected and impressive and inspiring forms of journalism that we know of. And at the same time, beyond that, I would also just think perhaps sometimes, as difficult as that can be, if I think about, paying my rent or, my pension savings to sort of fully embrace this if it was myself, that we also need to remember that journalism is a business, but it's also a mission, right? And it's not every kind of journalism that primarily has been about building sustainable businesses we can hand on to the next generation. You know, the black press in America, you know, the papers that led the anti-colonial struggle in countries across the world, and, you know, individual journalists who are speaking up on behalf of marginalized and underserved communities now, the work they do matters, even if they never, you know, list on the stock exchange, even if they never get so rich that they will endow chairs at prestigious universities and the like. And I think we sort of should remember that as well, that, you know, the work that was done at Quartz and is being done at Quartz has not been important just because it didn't hit the targets that were set out commercially. It would have been great if it had, and lots of people would have been very happy with that, but that doesn't take anything away from the value of trying and of doing great reporting, even if it doesn't always work out commercially.
I was just going to add, Finland sounds like a lovely place, but I don't necessarily want to move there where they trust us all. I think it's the atomized approach is really helpful, and what you just said about the business concerns and the mission and making sure that they mesh, because you know, a lot of these atomized formats where when we do special reports, we have a social media plan and we roll it out across, you know, we're working with audience teams to kind of make sure that we get the most eyeballs on it. It's tough, though, because these platforms don't always allow us to monetize properly, right? So there's an industry conversation that needs to happen there to make sure that this is viable, right? Because we're benefiting their platforms, they're benefiting ours, but it's a conversation that needs to happen. I mean, you know, Twitter is one of those spaces where it's a little bit easier to monetize. Instagram, not so much. TikTok, I have no idea yet kind of how that's going to play out. And I think we've all been burned as an industry from like MySpace or Second Life or whatever it was, right? Like we've been down that road. So it's hard with news budget shrinking, with personnel kind of being tight, to understand where you're going to invest next, to take that next step, be cutting edge, but still also be viable.
Sorry.
Different manner, but much in the way that Facebook was a few years ago. What Google chooses to reveal to people can make or break stories, and at this point, probably whole newsrooms. Do you see Google as just a place where people can search and find the stuff they're looking for, or is there more that Google could or should be doing to reveal stories and journalism to the public that doesn't know that it's out there?
I'll just quickly answer because I know we want to get to other people. But I would say, you know, Google search in particular has a very different approach than social media, right? Because it is this intent-based, you know, journey that people go on. And I think, you know, in my own personal experience, I do think that some of those stories that tend to break through, they have an evergreen shelf life to them, which is really helpful, right? It's beyond the breaking news. But if I'm searching for something on pediatric vaccines, which is why I'm wearing my mask today, you know, that's something that I want to see how that has evolved over time, and not necessarily just what the latest you know, updates are. So I think there is helpful evergreenness to search, but I also think we have more proactive services like Google News, like Google Discover, where there's also opportunities for people who are more in sort of that browse mentality to be able to see the top stories of the day, including, you know, we have sections on Google News around long reads that are a little bit more of the in-depth stories. So that's something we definitely have played around with. And I think, you know, with all of our products, it's all about sending traffic back to from our services to your sites and to your properties so that you can monetize properly on those surfaces. This is really very much a discovery mechanism that allows you to get new audiences through our properties.
So I'll take maybe two last questions. I know we run a little bit over the time, and people will have things that they got to. So we have two questions here in the front.
Hi, Martha Little with Audible. It's interesting to me that this barrier of emotion is such a huge barrier right now to news. And I was talking to a colleague recently at another outlet who was saying that they're finding in their app that how stories make them feel is a key gateway into whether somebody engages with a story or not. And I'd be very curious whether, you know, Google, New York Times, whether you guys are thinking about algorithms that sort for that.
Thanks. And one more question in the front here. Oh, sorry. Was there one more question? Thank you.
Yay. So I'm coming at this from two perspectives. I am a personal finance expert with books that have been reviewed in the New York Times. I've also written and been interviewed by Reuters. So I see things from, and I'm a freelancer for a lot of places. So I see things from different perspectives. Trust is always a huge thing. And so when it comes to transparency, I know a friend of mine, Nora, who was a Reuters scholarship winner, was looking at being able to click on the corners to learn more about the background of the photographer for a project. And I know that's something that's going on. And so I want to hear about like the next steps in transparency, and also when it comes to search. One thing I heard recently was the idea of taking a current event, the spoonful of sugar that attracts people in the title, and then including the story that you really want to talk about it. So using it as a lead-in to talk about the important stories.
Thank you. So feelings and transparency. Let's get a range of responses, and then we'll wrap it up there. Any takers?
Just because you mentioned just an algorithmic approach to journalism in the report. I mean, I think I know of software that marketers use for this purpose to like sort of sense the feelings of someone who engages with you know, an advertisement or something. The reason that we haven't done it with news is that you know, there's stories of just like great vital importance that are going to bum people out, and we want to make sure that, you know, if they're about, you know, the fate of our democracy or something, like, you know, that people are just get really key stories. We've sort of, so we have a lot of different products, not just a news report. Obviously, we have cooking and games and other things that are a little bit more uplifting. So the thing that we probably do that's closest to thinking about feelings is actually thinking about readers and developing relationships with them, readers and viewers and listeners, and developing a relationship with them that's a little more holistic than delivering just the headlines and trying to serve them. So.
I mean, I think again, just like with the emotions, I really do think that we should all take a hard look at like the feeling of powerlessness. I think that COVID, I really do believe part of the reason why we saw an increase in trust around our reports on COVID was because we were helping people with their lives, understand the latest information about what were the requirements of a mask and when should you get vaccinated and what's the science behind it. And if we treat more stories like that, I think that we would be able to really see, even in the toughest of stories, increase in both trust and less avoidance. I think about this, one of the hardest stories, I'm a new mother, so I'm like tearing up as I think about it, is gun violence. And you read stories about gun violence and you walk away devastated, horrified. So few news stories attach information about what is the policies being debated right now. Who are the congresspeople who are keeping us from pushing along any type of progress on changes in the United States around gun violence? When we don't do that as a news organization, we are not serving our audience in a way that can make them feel like they have any ability to make change. And so that really, I think, is something that we need to take a hard look at. You can't just present people with unending sorrow and not let them feel like they can make some sort of impact in their lives, even if it's small. Sorry. My baby's very cute. I wanted to have a happy little
See a photo. The emotion question is really interesting. It's not something that we use as any type of, you know, signal within Google search algorithm or anything like that. I do remember that there was a different social network did some experiments a few years ago. I won't get into the details of that, but it was not well received. Yeah, exactly. It was MySpace. Yes, it was not well received. I would say on the transparency point, I think we through the Google News Initiative, we have supported an organization called the Trust Project that I think probably some of you in the room have heard of, that has been, I think, started in 2016, which is very much about trying to understand what are the drivers of trust, what are they call them trust indicators, that's having gone through lots and lots of audience research and trying to marry sort of what are the main factors that drive trust with audiences, and then marrying those to journalistic principles and coming up with a set of principles and a sort of value system that news organizations can use. And we think about those as well on our own products, and have actually started to develop some products that show. We have a relatively new feature within search called About This Results, where when you see a result, you can hover over, a little menu to see all the information that we have about that result. Who the publisher is, when their website was incorporated, what do we know about this, so that we can start to train folks to ask those questions about whatever the result is, whatever the source is. And I think building that in, to whether it's an article page or to a search result, to start to prompt people, you should ask who the source is. You should want to know more about this journalist. And by building that into the product and not necessarily treating it as a separate curriculum that someone has to go through, I think we can slowly start to help people understand what those transparency cues are, and how to use that to evaluate information as they navigate the web.
Thank you. I think we will wrap it up here and thank Reuters for organizing the event and hosting us. All of you for bringing your curiosity and your orientation towards the future to the event today. And most of all, our panelists for sharing their thoughts on how they're navigating these challenges and opportunities. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming out.